Tonight we continue our series of interviews with candidates for Boston City Council in the preliminary election on September 24th. Our guest has a background as an attorney and as an advocate for the LGBTQ community. We'd like to welcome candidate running at large, Jeff Ross. Thank you much for being with us, Jeff.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Jeff, talk about that transition from advocate to candidate.
That's a great question. I think that it starts with your personal story. I grew up in a working class family. My mom was a waitress and a single parent, and she was gone by 3 o'clock in the afternoon every day. And I didn't learn to read until I was in the 12th grade. So we struggled a lot as a family. There were times when my little brother and sister came along that we were on public assistance. We did not have access to housing. And for short periods of time, we lived in a trailer on the side of the road. So when we talk about being the first in my family to graduate from college and law school, it was really important for me to look back and work to help families that struggled like mine. So working on family stabilization issues, challenging systemic inequities, and fighting to create economic opportunity for all. Really, my lived experiences, when we talk about kids in the Boston public school system, 23% with learning disabilities, 56% economically challenged, and 15% exposed to community violence. These are my lived experiences, and so I wake up every day with renewed enthusiasm to try to do something to interrupt and intervene in the cycles of others.
It's not unusual to see a council candidate who's an attorney too, but you did a lot of work with immigrants. Why?
Immigrant communities, when we're talking about a living wage, my mom made $2.11 an hour. When we talk about struggles and access to opportunity, challenges around English as a second language, these struggles are part of my, challenge growing up. And it was really important to me that I was doing something to make sure that we continue to be a city that turns around and opens doors and creates opportunities for those who come after us. So I had a successful career, and we helped a lot of families. There were 2 young girls that came to my law practice in the very beginning, and they were struggling with some of the same issues I struggled with, and getting them the wraparound services that we talk about, getting them into community dance classes and their parents into after school learning with them. The eldest of those 2 young girls is now a young woman, and she is in medical school in New Hampshire. So it's stories like that and success stories like that that really drive me to do this policy work, to be out there running for Boston City Council for September, to make a difference in people's lives.
Well, lately we've seen a number of councilors and candidates advocating for something dramatically better on the MBTA. It's not something that the council really does in a very direct way, but if you were on the council, what would you do to make that better?
I'm working out there to talk about the fare-free MBTA. When you look at the last 15 years and the interest we pay every year, $423 million to big banks, that's nearly $1 billion every 2 years, and approximately $6.4 billion in interest payments alone over the last 15 years. And if we were able to, for example, raise fares on Uber and Lyft by $1 or $2, we could generate hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue on the state side. And so I've been out there encouraging residents to talk to their state legislators when that happens, if that comes down the pipeline, to think about paying off the MBTA debt so that we can get to a point where we can use the revenue from the state to reinvest in the infrastructure. And I know that's not a city issue, but it affects the folks in our city, and transportation is a concern for residents across the city. And so we have to be mindful in city government about those challenges and look for ways to provide solutions.
Well, one area where the MBTA depends on the city to make things better is if maybe they want to put in a dedicated bus lane. Do you think the city should be pushing more in that direction?
I think when we're talking about engineering of traffic lights and we're talking about lanes, we need to figure out ways to make patterns of traffic flow more effectively and efficiently across the city. So I think that's definitely within the purview of city government.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with a candidate for City Council at Large, Jeff Ross. Jeff, one thing I'm sure you've probably heard from some neighborhoods around the city, especially because of what happened around the July 4th holiday weekend when we had so many shootings, is that what can we do to make prevention better?
Well, I mean, community policing, we are a national model for community policing. We have the most educated police force in the country. We have, the second lowest handgun crime rate in the continental United States. That doesn't mean that we stay where we're at. We can always do better. But there are new programs popping up. College Bound Dorchester, which is an intervention program. There are programs with Beth Israel and St. Peter's, one that I attended a few weeks ago, which was bringing young folks in from the Bowdoin, Geneva area and talking about with these youth ways to engage them in the vision of making our neighborhoods and our community better. And so there was a list of things that got developed out of the meeting.
What did you get from
and then the kids put leaves on things that were their priorities.
Any idea popping in?
I helped translate, actually, because I speak Portuguese, and there was a raffle afterwards. I think it's about youth engagement and creating opportunities for young folks to be engaged, regardless of what language you speak, in the planning, or at least thinking about the planning and the future of our city.
Another big problem in this city is the cost of housing, people being displaced. Anything that you want to do to put the brakes on that?
The cost of housing, I think that, there are theories out there that cost is reduced by building more. I think that, it's part of what we should be thinking about as a city, community dialogue. How do we impact the cost of housing? So I like ideas around restricted income housing. We've talked a lot on the campaign trail in different forum contexts about rent control. There is definitely a community discussion out there around rent control. We had that in the past, and the state ballot referendum overturned it. Boston and Cambridge supported that. So now there's legislation actually pending at the State House that would give cities and towns the opportunity to do that on a local level. So it could become a real discussion. It's a state legislative act that has to happen before we get there. And stabilizing families is really important to me, making sure that everyone has access to housing. I'm concerned with our homeless population, for example. I met a woman on the campaign trail last year at Woods Mullen. It was actually an event about recovery, and she got engaged in the campaign. She started riding buses and passing out materials and going to events for us. And she was diagnosed with stage 4 liver and spinal cancer in January. And I found out in the interim that she was homeless and living at Rosie's Place and getting services at Rosie's Place. And so she wasn't able to leave the Barbara McGinnis house. Once she was diagnosed, she needed attention and care. She didn't have a T-pass. She couldn't get out. She had to bring Corey documents, a letter from the homeless shelter, calls to the BHA and MBHP housing voucher. And I just think about the challenges that face homeless folks in our city. And we were able to connect her with services to get her housed. And that happened a couple of weeks ago. It was one of the great days on the campaign trail. But I think that we need to look for ways to connect folks to services in the city and look for populations that are struggling with on the edge. My family was on the edge, and we really need to, when we look at folks in the homeless population and we talk about addiction and recovery, a lot of folks that I've met doing this work are folks that had experienced early childhood violence, have learning issues. And so I'm really a huge proponent in our public school system of doing early intervention. So I've been advocating and fighting for more school nurses. We got one school nurse now in every single school starting in September. More psychologists and social workers to provide wraparound services to kids that experience community violence or early childhood violence, and to address some of the learning challenges that we have in school. It's 23% of the kids in the school system experience this. And so if we can do early intervention and continue to expand that help and services, it will lift some of the burden off of teachers.
As you probably know, the city has its own ordinance with restrictions on cooperation between the local agencies and federal immigration enforcement. There are attempts to strengthen that in some way. Would you like to see that strengthened?
I mean, I was involved in early advocacy around immigrant organizing, and I'm proud of that work. I think that, I've stepped out of that because I've been more in the political arena in the last couple of years, but really, those early conversations focused on building trust between police and immigrant communities. And so I'm for doing that. We need to make sure that folks who are from immigrant communities feel safe to reaching out to law enforcement if there are issues that they experience. I've been working with some folks in the Indian community and talking about trying to gather a coalition of small businesses and try to work to connect folks with our outreach departments and local law enforcement so that we can create relationships and build trust and provide the support that small businesses need. So.
I one final question
Excuse me.
about the schools, because there are some people who still come up to me and say, I'm very lucky I got my kid into one of the good schools, but we also have the observation out there, and I think Andrea Campbell, and the council president, has said this, there are too many people who are stuck with schools that are not up to standard. What would you like to do about that?
That's a great question. I think that one of the problems that we have is the way we measure our schools. The vertical 1 to 5 nature of scaling schools is always, if one school moves out of number 5, we're always going to have another one that goes into that place. So the idea of stigmatizing the school system just creates a certain challenge, and it sends a message out there. I know that parents who have kids in any school are proud of the school, they're proud of the teachers, they're proud of the administration. I think that the thing that we have as a challenge is really parents, in one neighborhood, for example, Charlestown, whose kids might go to school in Dorchester or Mattapan, and being able to be there to pick the kids up when they're sick and they need to go home, or having parent-teacher meetings. We have barriers to that just because of some of the ways that we're doing and assigning the school system now. So I'm a big proponent of parent involvement. I've seen it work with the kids that I've worked with, and so we have to look for ways to try to increase parent involvement, I think.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here.
Jeff Ross, candidate for City Councilor at Large. We'll have more news in just a moment.